and welcome to Olushola Live. My name is Olushola Taiwo, and I welcome you to my channel as I get myself situated to read chapter 6 of this awesome book, Our Mother's Sore Expectations. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you get a chance to check out chapters 1 through 5. Tonight we're going to read chapter 6 for sure, and we might get to chapter 7. Okay, this book is by Kehinde Adeola Ayeni. And here we go. Adewale knew immediately that a coup was being planned in which a lot of people were to die, him included. He was the one from the setting of the sun, west, who must not return home from the U.S. The king was the president, Rahim, and he would die on his special day, which was the day of the independence celebration for the country, October 1st, 4 days away. Muji and the girls would be killed as well, and so would General Ike. He was the one from the rising of the sun, east, who would wear his crown on his feet. The one on the way to the Holy Land, north, was General Issa. He went to his apartment, packed a bag, and left for home immediately. He told the ambassador that he had to meet with his supervisors with regards to his doctorate thesis in Boston, and that he would be back in 2 days. If they needed him, all they had to do was call. He knew that he needed to act very fast. He took a plane to New York City, from which he was lucky to get on a flight to London. He knew that once he got to London, there definitely would be a plane going to Lagos. He arrived at Heathrow Airport in the early hours of Wednesday, September 27, 1978. He approached many airlines trying to get on the earliest one out of London, and finally he got a seat on British Airways after he paid a passenger £2,000 to give up his seat in coach. The plane took off at 10 o'clock that morning, and when he sat back in his seat, he breathed a sigh of relief. He tried to speak with Rahim from Heathrow Airport, calling him on his private line several times, but was not successful, although he did not know what he would have told him had he succeeded. He thought of Muji and the girls, his daughters. He could not let any harm come to them. He thought of Nkema the last time he saw her after he had just become the aide-de-camp. She had been pregnant and radiant. He could not allow any harm to come to her either. He heard that she gave birth to another child about a year ago. He could not sit still in his seat and wanted the plane to move faster. He wondered who the people behind the coup were. At least he knew one of them was Issa. He devoted a few minutes of his thoughts to the man. Personally, he was indifferent to the man. He was not even jealous of the fact that he had to share his current girlfriend with him. He did not know if Issa was aware that he was sharing the 25-year-old beauty queen, but he was cognizant of the affair that Issa had been having with Rahim's second wife. He wondered what could be going on in the man's mind. Were he to succeed in the coup and become the president of the country, would he install Rahim's second wife as the first lady, or maybe the beauty queen? He smiled at the idea. He felt itchy sitting in the plane, which seemed to be crawling through the sky. He looked out of the window and stared at nothing for a while. He looked back into the plane and at his fellow travelers. An overwhelmed young mother had a set of twins who were about 6 months old and a toddler with her. The toddler started to cry and make demands on the mother, who was trying to feed one of the twins. The mother tried to calm him and gave him a cookie. He threw it away and continued to cry. He wanted her to put the baby down and hold him. The second twin had been asleep on the floor in a baby carrier. The cookie hit the baby in the face and it started to cry too. The twin being fed pushed the bottle from its mouth and started to cry as well. Very soon the three of them were bawling on top of their lungs. Other passengers tried not to look at the children and their mother, pretending as if they were not there. The mother tried to calm the crying children. She could not, so she started to cry as well. Adewale pressed the button for the flight attendant, got up from his seat, and walked the two rows to the crying lot. He picked up the toddler, hugged and soothed him. He stopped crying. A flight attendant arrived and picked up one of the twins, and the mother hugged the second twin to her. The mother looked at Adewale and thanked him. He nodded to her and asked if he could take the toddler with him back to his seat, and she gratefully said yes. He returned to his seat and sat down. The toddler started to cry again. He did not want him to sit down. He wanted them to go somewhere else, so Adewale obliged him and started to walk around the plane with him in his arms. They strode up to the flight attendant station, and they all admired the boy. They offered him a cookie, which he accepted and ate. They took turns holding him, and he let them. After a while, they needed to return to their jobs, so they gave him back to Adewale and suggested that he show the cockpit to the toddler. Adewale accepted the invitation and walked through the first-class cabin up to the cockpit. He introduced himself to the pilots and introduced the toddler to them as my new friend, whose name I don't know. He told them that he was helping his mother, who had a set of twins. The pilots chatted with him and the toddler for a while, and when he turned to go back to his seat, walking through the first-class cabin, he noticed that someone seemed to be watching him. He looked back and saw General Issa. The man had turned in his seat and was staring at his departing back with a questioning look. He assumed that Issa was not sure if he was actually seeing him. The toddler must have thrown him off. Adewale hugged the boy more to himself and spoke into his ears the way a doting father would do to his son. He pretended that he had looked back to check his son's leg. When he got back to the mother, one of the twins was asleep in the baby carrier and she had the other one in her arms. Adewale asked if he could hold the boy for her for the rest of the trip, and she smiled her gratitude at him. His name is Tolu. He is 22 months old. Here is his bag with his food, toys, and diapers. We are going home to my mother so she can help me with them. I can't cope with the three of them all by myself in England. My husband is there, and we will be separated for a while. That is the best we can do for them now, she told him in resignation. The man sitting next to Tolu and his family asked Adewale if he would like to change seats with him, and he agreed. The man thankfully packed his belongings and went to Adewale's old seat while he sat down next to the young mother. Not quite 5 minutes after Adewale sat down with Tolu in his arms and started to feed him from a small bowl with a spoon, General Issa walked by him and tried very hard not to stare at him. Adewale bent down to Tolu as Issa passed him by a second time. He babbled gibberish to the boy, who laughed with delight, sputtering food all over his shirt. Issa appeared satisfied. He returned to his seat, taking the other aisle away from them without looking in their direction. Adewale was worried. He wondered if he recognized him. He felt that Issa was obviously not sure. He wondered if he would ask the captain for the manifest of the plane. Would they give it to him? He might call Washington, D.C. to check on his whereabouts. They would tell him that he had gone to Boston. He worried for the rest of the flight and continued to play with Tolu to distract himself. The tired toddler finally fell asleep. When they arrived at the airport in Lagos, Adewale, still needing the toddler as a decoy, offered to walk with the mother through immigration and customs. He carried her bags for her while she pushed the 3 sleeping children in a stroller. They were the last to get off the plane. He did not see General Issa again. He cleared his immigration and customs and walked out of the airport with the young mother and her 3 children. Her mother was there to meet her, and upon seeing her mother, she started to cry. Adewale stayed by the stroller containing the children until she was done hugging and crying to her mother. The young mother told of how Adewale was very helpful on the plane. Her mother hugged and thanked him. They offered him a lift into town when he told them he was going to Lagos Island. He had been discreetly scanning the arrival hall for anything unusual because he knew that he had to be very careful. The coup plotters must not know that he was in the country. He was convinced that Issa was already on the phone trying to track him down in the U.S. He was the last to get into the car as he climbed in. He took one last look at the arrival area and he spotted Issa still staring at him with that questioning look. He sat next to the driver while the young mother and her mother sat in the back with the 3 children who had woken up and started to fuss. He started to panic. He thought very fast of what he should do. He needed to get on the phone and call Washington, D.C., and quickly too. He had to be alive and working in the U.S. He thought of Jack in the CIA, and it occurred to him that he could keep him alive in Washington while he was at home. He thought of asking Tolu's grandmother if she had a phone that could make international calls, but decided against it. That would be too complicated and it would be too expensive for her. Then he remembered Big Daddy. Why didn't I think of him first? He kicked himself. Big Daddy would know what to do. He told the driver that he had to get out of the car at the next intersection, and he explained it to the puzzled women that looked on him as he just remembered that he needed to see a friend in Ajegule. The grandmother offered to take him there, and she asked the driver to make a turn and go towards Ajegule. But Adewale told them that it would not be necessary. It would take them out of their way, he explained. The children were tired as it was. They should go on home instead. They thanked him again for his help on the plane, and as he was getting out of the car, he tickled Tolu, who chuckled with delight. He waved at them as they drove off. He was not sure if they had been followed, so he walked briskly across the busy highway, crossing to the other side of the road while drivers honked and cursed at him. He made it safely and got into the next taxi he saw idling, waiting for a passenger. The driver started to protest, but when Adewale showed him a wad of bills, he smiled and said, "Oga, where to?" He arrived at Big Daddy's house at about 8 o'clock at night, and the older man was just settling down to dinner. He was both pleased and surprised to see his young friend. Adewale pulled him to the bedroom and they hugged one another. He asked to use his phone and he called his friend in the CIA. "Jack, you remember that poem from Shakespeare about the changing of the guards in the kingdom? I am there now, but I am in Boston, okay? Just for 4 days." Jack started to protest. "I don't know how to do that, Adewale. Color and accent man." "Jack, you are a very smart guy. The smartest I know, and I'm sure you can do it," Adewale said and hung up without giving him an opportunity to protest again. He told Big Daddy as much as he could about his suspicion of a coup, that they had to stop it and keep the president, Moji, and the girls safe. He needed to get to the presidential palace without anyone knowing that he was in the country. Ike and Ikem had to be warned as well. General Issa arrived in his house on Victoria Island, part of Lagos, later that evening, still not sure if it was Adewale he saw on the phone with the woman and the babies. They had looked a lot like a family, but the man had looked very much like Adewale. He convinced himself that it was not Adewale and spent the rest of the evening taking care of certain details concerning the coup. He went to bed at about midnight, but the man on the plane continued to nag at him, so he got out of bed and called the nation's embassy in the U.S. It was about 7 o'clock in the evening there, and he asked to speak with the military attaché. He asked for his home number when he was told that he was not at the embassy. He called Adewale's home and the phone rang about 5 times before he picked it up. "Hello?" Adewale said. Issa was so thrown off that he could not speak. "Hello? Anybody there?" Adewale asked again. Issa answered and said, "Sorry, wrong number." He hung up and dismissed Adewale being in the country from his mind. He concluded that it had been an uncanny resemblance between the two men. They were like identical twins. Besides, Adewale was a playboy and not a devoted father like the man he saw on the plane. Adewale was terrified and impressed that Issa actually called to check on him in the States. He called Jack back and said, "Buddy, you are a genius and the smartest. You're even smarter than me. Next one's on me." "You bet your life on it," replied Jack. What Jack did was to connect Adewale's home phone in Washington to Big Daddy's number, so after the phone rang in the U.S. 3 times, it started to ring at Big Daddy's house. Big Daddy called the president on his private line after midnight, and Moji picked up the phone. She sounded very sleepy as she said hello, and Big Daddy gave the phone to Adewale. "Hush, Moji," he whispered into the phone, and she knew that it was him. That was what he always said to her when he needed her to calm down during a temper tantrum, or when he needed to explain something to her. She also realized that something was wrong, and that was why he was saying hush to her. They had spoken on the phone many times, and he did not start his conversations with "Hush, Moji." She was quiet. "Hush, Moji," he said to her again, and she started to cry. He knew that she understood. "I need to come in with Big Daddy, okay?" Moji said, "Okay, I know. Call in 5. He called back in 5 minutes and Rahim was on the line. Come through your old door, put it in a bag. The guards will be expecting Big Daddy. Rahim hung up. Adewale was impressed with Moji, that she was actually smarter than she let on. She got the message and was able to convey it to her husband in a way that he got it too. Moji did understand perfectly well, and she knew that their lives must be in danger. After she told Rahim that it was obvious that Adewale was in the country and something terrible was about to happen, she started to pack a bag. She and the children had initially been scheduled to leave for Japan after the Independence Day celebration coming up the following Monday, but she had decided to leave before the ceremony. She was to go to the U.S. to the Mayo Clinic for a medical examination. She had been having some unexplainable bone pain in her left knee, and tests done in Lagos hospitals found nothing wrong. Iya had gone to their home outside of Zuru the week before to be with her own mother who was ill. Moji went to her room across from Rahim's, where she had been asleep with him. Her children were asleep in the room. She dressed the 5-year-old Amina and the 3-year-old Zainab in some warm clothes without waking them. Rahim went into the room. He had dressed in his uniform like he was ready to go to work that early morning at 1 o'clock. Moji looked at him, she went over to him, and they hugged. She started to cry, and he reassured her that everything would be fine. Moji clung to him until they received the call that Big Daddy was at the door. Rahim kissed his wife and went out to meet his guests. Big Daddy parked at the back of the residential quarter in the palace, very close to the kitchen door, and when Rahim opened the door, Adewale, who had been lying on the floor of the Peugeot 505 sedan, covered with a rug, got up and ran into the dark kitchen. Big Daddy went in after him. Rahim embraced Adewale and they went to his bedroom to talk. When he saw Moji holding the sleeping Zainab in his arms, he spontaneously went over to her and kissed her. He noticed she seemed to have lost a lot of weight since the last time he saw her about 4 months before. When she came to the United Nations on some women's conference, he wondered why she was so thin. Rahim picked up the sleeping Amina. Adewale picked up the bags, and they made their way quietly to the dark kitchen and passed the children and the bags into the car. Moji hugged her husband, who had tears in his eyes. She laid on the floor of the car next to the children, who were awake and looking on with wide eyes. She hugged them to her, told them that they would be fine, but that they had to be quiet. Adewale covered them with the rug, and Big Daddy drove away. Big Daddy and Adewale had decided that he would hide them out in a safe house for the time being and get them out of the country as soon as it was possible. Adewale told Rahim all the event of the past 2 days and his strong suspicions of a coup. Rahim nodded at him and said that the Vetro thing was too big to just blow over. Thank you, my son, he said. Adewale phoned Ike in Enugu. This is Adewale, he said. When the rooster didn't attend the community meeting to discuss the burning issue of how to appease the humans, guess who was given up to the humans for sacrifices? The rooster has to protect the hens and chicks from the cruel humans. They are on their way. He quickly hung up. Ike immediately understood and reacted just as rapidly. I am not losing another family to any damn war, he said. Never again. He woke and came and instructed her to pack. Early in the morning, he told his personal assistant that Ikem had gone to England, that they received a call in the middle of the night that her sister who lived there had been involved in a motor accident. Ikem left later in tears with her 2 children. Adewale called up the governors of the northern, western, and the southern regions. He told them in parables what was coming, and they all understood and fortified their stations, while at the same time acting as if nothing was coming. Each of them looked deeply at their staff and what seemed to be unusual behavior, especially at the ones friendly or loyal to General Issa. No arrest was made, as this would only alert the coup plotters. They decided by communicating with one another in codes that they would counter-strike at midnight on Independence Day, since that was the only way all the coup plotters could be arrested. Moji and her daughters were smuggled out of the country the following day. She was worrying about Iya, fearing that the woman could be in danger as the coup plotters might have planned to wipe out all of Rahim's family. Moji had steadily, if reluctantly, grown to love the woman that she wanted so much to hate. Over the years, she had developed such a tremendous amount of respect for the number one wife, who had loved her and her children unconditionally, that she did not want to lose her. She told Big Daddy that they should stop in Zuru to pick her on their way out of the country, but Big Daddy refused. That was not his instruction, he told her. His instructions were to get her out of the country safely and as soon as possible. Moji dug in her heels and refused to leave the country without Iya. She told Big Daddy that she was the first lady of the country and she was countering any orders that Adewale might have given him. "You won't be the first lady for long if this plane doesn't take off now," Big Daddy said to himself, "but I will call Adewale and let him know," was all he said to her. He called Adewale and told him that Moji was refusing to leave the country without Iya. Adewale was shocked that Moji was actually worried about her husband's first wife and her rival on every front. For the second time in 2 days, he saw another side to the woman whom he thought he knew so well. He told Rahim about Moji's refusal to leave the country without Iya, and Rahim, taking the phone from him, told his wife that Iya was actually on her way to the U.S. as they spoke, that he asked her to leave and she left early that morning. He was not surprised at her concern for her co-wife. Adewale remained hidden in the presidential palace, and Jack continued to keep him alive in the U.S. He had called his friend earlier the second day to give him the number to a private line in the presidential palace, and each time he was called at his office or in his house in Washington, D.C., the call came through to the palace. True to their expectations, Issa struck at midnight on October 1st, 1978, when he and his forces attempted to storm the palace in the takeover. Rahim's forces, which had been strategically positioned, met them in a counterattack. The same scenario was played out all over the country in each of the 4 regions. Issa and his company were unpleasantly surprised at each point, and they were all taken into custody. In all, 400 soldiers, 100 officers, 10 of them generals in the army, and 40 civilians, all of them in one top government office or another, were arrested and were in jails all over the country by 8 o'clock that morning. By midday Washington time, Adewale was in his office at the embassy, and he and the country's ambassadors to the USA were addressing the international press. Nobody in the embassy knew that he had been out of the USA at any time. It took about a week for Adewale to calm the international press from his position as the military attaché. His country was in the news all week with analysts and experts on the African nation trying to understand why the military dictators would not allow democracy in the country. There were many criticisms of Rahim's regime. Adewale had to dredge up all his charms and knowledge of government, the military, and politics to answer all the questions amicably. He did well too, as he had trained himself on all the fronts to prepare him as the spokesperson for his country. He was on the American network television stations every day that week. He and the ambassador were invited to the White House, and all the issue about dictatorship and human rights violation were brought up again. The President of the United States, with whom Adewale had played golf on 3 occasions, asked the younger man what Rahim's administration planned to do with the arrested coup plotters. Rahim assured him that they would be given a fair trial and imprisoned if found guilty. The United States President wanted to know if there was a possibility that the men might be killed, if Rahim was entertaining that idea at all. The United States of America, he pointed out, frowns on such activities. He made it clear to Adewale and the ambassador that if the coup plotters were arbitrarily killed, his administration would not support Rahim. Adewale assured the United States President that the men would be given a fair trial in the court of law and invited United Nations to send observers to monitor the trial. Rahim summoned him back home 1 week after the coup failed. Adewale packed his bags and bid the USA farewell armed with his doctorate degree as well as lifelong friends and international connections. He returned home to his mentor. He was not given a specific position on his return. He just became the personal assistant to Rahim, who insisted that he accompanied him everywhere he went. Here ends chapter 6 on page 162. I'm going to continue because chapter 6 was really short to chapter 7 after a sip of water. Chapter 7, page 163. The year 1978 marked the beginning of severe economic problems for the oil-rich country, even though more than 2 million barrels of oil were drilled daily, which fetched about $28 billion a year. But the wealth did not translate into economic development of the country or improvement in the standard of living of the people. The average citizen remained poor, and the government did not have money to pay the wages of the many civil servants. The reason for this was simply that the money was going into the pockets of the people in government. The citizens started to hear and witness horrendous stories of how the wealth of the country was being spent by the few people in government. Governors and ministers were buying private jets for their personal uses. They were building mansions all over the country with public funds as well as in Europe and America. They would hold parties like carnivals for the flimsiest excuses and spray money on one another while they danced. And when they ran out of cash to do this, they would instruct bank managers to open banks for them at all hours of the night. They would remove money in bags and sacks to continue to spray one another. Money budgeted for the running of many public services. That year, Rahim announced to the people that the economy was in trouble, and as a result of this, some measures were being taken by the military to decrease excessive expenditures. There were cuts in funding for health care of the people and for education. The universal primary education, which was instituted some years before to ensure that every child of school age was in school, was stopped. Defense continued to take the lion's share of the budget of the country, not at war. A whopping 25% of the annual budget. Inflation continued and wages were still not paid on time. This went on for months and people continued to cry out loud. So Rahim came onto the national television to inform the citizens that the country would be approaching the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to borrow some money so that the government would have money to take care of them. The citizens did not want the country to borrow money. They knew that the money would be embezzled by non-existent big projects. The country would still be in debt and the people would still be hungry. Adewale advised Rahim to pretend to ask the general population if the country should borrow money because it would give them the feeling that they were participating in their government. Rahim appeared on television again and asked the citizens to think about the loan that the government was planning to take on their behalf, that there would be debates about it, and that at the end he was willing to go with what the people decided. Many people in the country did not understand his system of governing. If you are interested in what we have to say about the loans, they said amongst themselves, let us put it to a vote and then it would be decided. Nevertheless, the people took all that they could from their government and there were debates all over the country by citizens in whichever way they thought the government would hear them. People prayed in mosques and churches asking God to speak to Rahim on their behalf and that the country should not go into debt. Articles regularly appeared in the daily newspapers talking about the perils of indebtedness, that if only the people in government were not thieves, the country was rich enough to preclude any need for borrowing money. The country continued to earn money every day. Actors acted plays in theaters, on the television and the radio, lamenting the impending doom of getting into debt. Musicians sang songs about the evil of embarking on the enterprise of borrowing money from the International Monetary Fund. They sent all these messages to Rahim, and he heard all that they had to say. Even though the people did not have the opportunity of going to the polling booths to vote on the issue, it was obvious that they spoke with one voice in telling their dictator government not to borrow the money. In spite of all this, Rahim went ahead and borrowed $50 billion from the International Monetary Fund. He told the country that he did not have any other choice but to take the loan, and announced the restrictions that would have to occur in the standard of living of everyone as a result of the loan. He continued to squeeze the already empty and dry average man and woman on the street. The money came, and many more of such loans followed without him informing the citizens about the other loans. He and his cronies in the government continued to embezzle all these monies. Iya, Muji, and the children returned home in December of 1978. Moji had a series of tests done in the United States, but no cause was found for the knee pain that continued to plague her. 3 months after General Issa's aborted coup, all the generals involved, including Issa, were killed on Rahim's orders. The other officers were dishonorably dismissed from the army, and most of them earned prison sentences ranging from 20 years to life for treason. The world was appalled by Rahim's actions, and the criticism of the human rights violation increased. Once again, it was Adewale's job to talk to the international press to justify his boss's action. He tried his very best. He dug into the history of the country and came up with several convoluted and confusing but charming explanations for the government's decision. But the citizens were disgusted, and there were demonstrations on the streets, most of which deteriorated into riots to condemn Rahim and his methods. Many people called for his resignation, saying that he was a bad leader who was corrupt and after his own self-interest, plunging the country into more and more debt, while he and his associates continued to pocket the money borrowed on behalf of the people. Rahim and the members of the Supreme Military Council decided that the way to handle the criticism and demonstrations was to appease the people. The federal government released more monies for the running of the regions. On their instructions, salaries of civil servants were paid on time, and there was even an increase in salaries. Rahim warned the governors of the regions to make sure their staff were paid on time, and that he did not want to hear complaints coming from the regions about the late payments of salaries. He instructed the central bank governor to ensure that more money was in circulation for people to spend, and when the governor told him that he did not know how to do that, Rahim asked him to print more currency. The governor tried to explain to him that printing more money would adversely affect the economy, as it would cause inflation and devaluation of the currency. But Rahim impatiently told him that he did not care for details. All he wanted was for the criticism to die down. The criticisms did quiet down for a while following all these actions on the part of the government, and the citizens hoped that things would continue in that direction. In 1979, about 5 months after the coup plotters were killed, and at a time that Rahim's popularity amongst the citizens was at its lowest, a group of young army officers headed by a major in the army orchestrated a coup to overthrow him. They were able to infiltrate the presidential palace without anybody suspecting anything. By this time, Adewale had moved back to his old quarters in the palace, and the aide-de-camp to Rahim was housed elsewhere on the grounds. Moji, who had been asleep with Rahim in his bedroom, awoke to the noise of gunfire and immediately wakened her husband. They both quickly got into their dressing gowns and ran across to Moji's bedroom, where her daughters were asleep. Picking the sleeping girls and running across the hallway to wake Iya, Moji directed them to the secret door in the closet in her room, which they pried open as the sound of gunshots drew nearer to them. They were able to get into the door and lock both the closet and the door after themselves by the time the assassins arrived at Rahim's bedroom. They heard the door to the bedroom being hacked down. They ran through the dark tunnel until they arrived at Adewale's apartment. They hit hard on the door and the noise woke him. He instinctively picked up his gun and went out of his bedroom, where he found the country's first family standing in his kitchen in their dressing gowns. Without any of them speaking, he quickly put on a shirt and quietly led them down to the basement. He retrieved 3 guns that he had hidden there and led them into one of the tunnels. They made their escape and emerged about 10 minutes later in the neighborhood of Obalende. While they hid in the shadows, Adewale went looking for transportation and returned 5 minutes later driving a Peugeot 504 sedan. They got into the car and he drove very fast through the deserted Lagos roads, knocking on Big Daddy's door 30 minutes later at 1 o'clock in the morning. Big Daddy, without asking any questions, ushered in Iya, Moji, and her daughters and disappeared with them into his house, while Adewale and Rahim, still in their night clothes, turned back. They did not have to talk to one another about what they had to do. Each was determined that the coup would not succeed. Rahim told himself that he was not done with being the president of the country, that he was not ready to run into the night like a coward and be afraid for the rest of his life. Adewale was too invested in Rahim's government to let the coup plotters succeed. He had been waiting for his turn to become the president, and he was not willing to give up that dream. He knew that if the people succeeded, he was as good as dead. He was not ready to die, nor going to exile and live the rest of his life in a foreign country. With these thoughts, they returned to the palace. Adewale abandoned the car that he stole, and they went in through the tunnel the opposite way that they exited an hour earlier. When they got to the basement of his apartment, however, the opening had been sealed from the inside, and they could not pry open the door. Adewale remembered the geography of the tunnels, which had been constructed as a maze, led Rahim back out into the city. Lagos was asleep and peaceful. The citizens were unaware that groups of dictators were fighting to rule over them. Adewale and Rahim returned to the stolen and abandoned car to drive about a mile to the northern entrance into the palace. Close to the lagoon, he opened the trunk of the car and took out the tools for changing the tires and was lucky to find an iron rod about 2 feet long. They abandoned the car again, walked about half of a mile away from the wall around the palace, but close to the lagoon and concealed by a boat that was anchored on the pier close by. Adewale started to dig into the dirt with the iron rod. He located another opening to another tunnel, which he pried open with the tools, and a few minutes later, he and Rahim were in the tunnel. They closed the lid after themselves and groped their way another half of a mile, emerging in the kitchen of the executive offices 15 minutes later, covered in mud and slime. It was empty at that early hour in the morning. They gradually and slowly crept around the palace, going through the hallways, trying to make their way to the president's office. They saw bodies of Rahim's guards and palace staff sprawled all over the place, with blood and human tissue on the walls. As they approached the office area, they spotted armed soldiers, singly and in teams, talking in muted tones, their guns at the ready. They were able to hide from these soldiers as they crept their way toward the office, but as they got closer, there were more armed men, making it difficult not to be seen. Adewale decided that they needed to eliminate the guards and take their chances. There did not seem to be any other way around that, and retreat was impossible by this time. 2 of the guns had silencer pieces. He signaled to Rahim what he intended to do, at the same time taking the first shot at a soldier standing by himself. He silently went down. By the time they were in the long hallway that opened into the president's secretary's office, Adewale pulled the heavy bulletproof iron door shut and locked it from inside. In that way, keeping out other soldiers who might attempt to come in to assist the coup plotters in the executive office. They found out and went in 2 different directions, both of which opened into the presidential office, silently shooting at the soldiers in their way. They simultaneously burst into the office from the 2 entrances and opened fire on the men who were there. The element of surprise was in their favor, as the men in the office expected the guards posted at the doors to protect them, or at least warn them. There were 6 men in the office, and 4 went down immediately. The other 2 recovered very rapidly. They pulled out their guns, which they randomly fired. Adewale and Rahim and the 2 men exchanged fire for a very long time, and they could hear the other soldiers trying to come in from the hallway to assist the coup plotters. As Adewale and Rahim were exhausting their ammunition, the shots from the other men stopped. Rahim, who still had a couple of bullets left in one of his guns, checked the men who were down and for good measure ensured that they were dead. Adewale came out of his hiding, and the 2 men went over to each other and stood side by side. They were quiet for some time. Rahim clasped Adewale on the back and went to his desk, pulled out his radio equipment with which he could address the nation, and started to speak to the citizens, almost all of whom were still asleep. The broadcast from the president's office had the power to override any other broadcasting from other radio or television stations, all of which were under government control. This had been put in place by the dictatorship government such that the final orders to the people would come from the presidential office. He addressed the citizens and told them of the attempted but failed coup, detailing all the lives that had been lost. While he was doing this, Adewale started to call the many heads of states of the United States of America, England, and several African countries on the phone to inform them of the attempted but failed coup. He called the international press as well to let them know that Rahim remained the president of the country. Next, he called officers that he was certain were loyal to Rahim, and within the hour, the palace was full of soldiers again to provide security and clean up the mess. Having established himself as the president still, Rahim called the different regions to check on his governors and was met with the news that the governors of both the western and northern regions had been killed. Every soldier in the country, on learning of the coup, reported to his post within the hour, as failure to report might suggest a participant in the coup. Thus, Rahim was able to hold on to his presidency again. The world was aghast at Rahim's action when a week later the coup plotters were arrested and killed, and criticism increased with threats of one embargo or the other on the country. Adewale again had to clean up the mess with the international press, and on instruction from Rahim, told the world that the country did not need a new military dictator government. What the country needed was to return to democratically elected government, and he would be preparing the citizens for that. He promised to hand over power within 2 years. This lessened the intensity of the criticisms. Following the coup, Adewale advised Rahim to change the government officials on a regular basis to prevent them from getting too comfortable in the post that they would start to entertain the idea of overthrowing his government. Rahim took the advice, and the many different government officials had their appointments terminated within 6 months to a year of their being appointed to the posts. This did make them feel quite unsecure, and they did not have the time to establish bonds with their colleagues enough to have time to plan coups. But because they knew that they would be removed from their posts without any warning, they spent the first few months of their appointment stealing as much public funds as they could lay their hands on. Wow. On the national level, it created a situation that policies could not be executed, as each new man, after his appointment, wanted to do things differently than his predecessor, to prove to Rahim that he was a better man for the job. So he would form his own policies that he would not have enough time to implement. This caused too much confusion and fragmentation in the country, as governors and ministers were changed at the most every 8 months. 6 months after the aborted coup, the pain in Moji's knee became worse and seemed to be affecting the whole of her left leg. She returned to the Mayo Clinic, and this time she was diagnosed with a form of slow-growing bone cancer. She had just turned 32 years old. The doctors suggested amputation of the left leg above the knee, and she was flabbergasted. She refused and became very difficult to manage by the doctors. She was agitated all the time and constantly irritable. Rahim took a lot of time off over a period of 6 weeks and went to the United States several times to be with her and convince her to go along with the doctor's suggestion. Moji explained to her husband that she would not have her leg cut off and that she might as well be dead. She would not be beautiful anymore, and he might use that as an excuse to find another girl to marry. She would lose everything, she cried. Nobody would want her anymore. Her old rivalry with Iya resurfaced, and she became afraid that the other woman would inherit her children. She was illogical in her fears, and Rahim had to convince her of his love for her that had continued to grow each day, not just because of her beauty, and that he would not marry another woman. Moji finally agreed to the amputation. She returned home later in the year with prosthesis, and she became severely depressed. She would not return to her role as the First Lady and became secluded. The wife of the Vice President had to take over most of her functions, such as hosting visiting dignitaries and many of her charity organizations, and sometimes one of her sisters would accompany Rahim to state functions. The citizens started to speculate why they were not seeing their First Lady anymore. Some said she had gone insane or that Rahim had beaten her so much that she was now ugly. Others said that they heard she had cancer and it had spread all over her body and that it was a matter of weeks before she died. The military government did not deem it necessary to tell the citizens what was going on with their beloved First Lady, and so they were not told anything officially, and the rumors continued. During this terrible period for Muji, Adewale came to realize that Rahim did love her a lot. He stayed with her as much as he could. He accompanied her to all her doctor's appointments, and he continued to reassure her that he loved her no matter what happened to her. Iya, as characteristic of her, took good care of the entire family. Muji completed a course of chemotherapy, and her doctors pronounced her in good physical health. Sometime in mid-1981, she told Adewale one morning when they were having coffee together that she was pregnant. Adewale was surprised and asked her who the father of the baby was. Muji sullenly told him that the father was Rahim. Adewale did not say a word. "He loves me, Adewale. He loves me with all his heart, and I pray to God that I can love him back half as much as he loves me," Muji started to say quietly. "This past year convinced me of his love for me. This is all crazy. I never imagined myself in a polygamous marriage, praying to love my husband and actually liking my co-wife, but I do. Iya is a great woman, and she has taken good care of me in the past year more than my own mother could have. It is also strange. The least I can do for Rahim is carry his child," she told Adewale, with tears running down her face. Adewale looked at her for a long time. He wondered at this emotion called love as he contemplated this beautiful, self-centered, and ambitious Muji, and he could see that she seemed to be at some peace with herself. He started to realize that a lot was missing from his own life. "You have carried 2 children for him before, Muji. Those lovely girls are his," he said to her, and she nodded her head in consent, without saying a word. Muji emerged from her seclusion later in the year 1981. She continued to be lovely as she always did whenever she was pregnant, and the country's social circle welcomed her back. On her second major outing, to open a new hospital that was donated by a Lagos philanthropist, a member of the press asked her why she removed herself from the public for over a year. She told him that she had cancer of the bone and that her left leg had been amputated and she underwent chemotherapy. It had been a difficult year for her, she continued, and she had become severely depressed after she lost her leg, but that she was feeling much better. She lifted the hem of her wrapper and showed the press her prosthesis. The journalists pressed forward excitedly because Muji had never talked to them before. Even though they adored her, she had always responded to their questions with smiles and waves. They had more questions about her leg, but she was her old self again. She waved and smiled at them and went about the business she had come to conduct. The newspapers were filled with pictures of her the following day and of her legs before and after. Physicians were brought onto television for their opinion. What kind of cancer could she have had? What did it mean? Would she die? And on, the questions and speculations continued. Following this, Muji just resumed her role as First Lady as much as she could. The country continued to borrow more and more money from whoever would lend them the money and continue to enforce the restrictions that came with the loans on the citizens. Standard of living continued to fall for the people, inflation continued, and very soon the people in the country could not afford to eat. There was not enough food being grown to feed her citizens. Many people left their farms and migrated to the cities because of the uncertainties of farming without government support, loans, and other needed assistance. Slums started to appear on the outskirts of many cities. Crime rate was on the rise. Children were out of classrooms and running the street, and then the government began to import food. Still, it was out of reach of anyone except the military elite and their friends and associates who continued to share the wealth of the country amongst themselves. Malnutrition was on the rise, and it became a common sight to see children with enlarged heads and big tummies, but small legs and arms as a result of kwashiorkor, or dried up children as a result of marasmus. Even the adults were not spared, as signs of malnutrition were seen on them as well. Diseases flourished, infant and childhood mortality rose in leaps and bounds where they had been down before. Rahim and his government refused to see all these, or refused to acknowledge that they were happening in spite of cries from people in all of those ways that they had to protest. The administration continued to embezzle public funds. Adewale continued to hang around the presidential palace without any specific job description. He was Adewale's right-hand man, performing odd jobs for him, but mostly dealing with the international community, which continued to criticize and sometimes threaten the country with embargo if the country did not return to democracy. He became the unofficial foreign affairs minister for the country. In 1982, Moji gave birth to another girl, and she was given the name Fatima, the name that she refused for herself earlier in her marriage to Rahim. The baby, like her sisters, looked very much like their mother. Rahim had just turned 62 years old and Moji 33 years old. That day, another attempt was made on Rahim's life. It was during the independence celebration on October 1st. Moji did not attend because Zainab was just recovering from measles. It happened while Rahim was standing on the podium addressing the nation at the stadium where thousands of citizens had gathered to celebrate their independence from the British, most of them school children who had spent the day marching in parades. Adewale had been sitting beside him while Rahim's aide-de-camp stood behind him as he spoke. Adewale could not explain to himself what made him get up at the time that he did. As far as he was concerned, it was serendipity. Same as when he just happened to be dating Nkem, who looked like General Ike's deceased wife. Just pure luck, he later decided. But he had gotten up from his seat in the middle of the president's address and walked to his left side, standing there for a moment. He scanned the arena of the stadium, and as he looked to the east, something reflected almost blinding light into his eyes. He assumed that it might be a window glass, but thought that the stadium was too big for anything that far away on the other end to reflect the light on him. When within a split second he saw the gunman. He did not have much time to act. All he was able to do was push Rahim away, and in the process of doing that, he took the bullet which went straight into his right lung. Security tightened around them while Adewale lay on the ground. Pandemonium broke out as people fled in all directions, tumbling over one another in their haste to leave the stadium. Rahim shouted to his aide-de-camp to go back to the presidential palace and make sure that his family was safe. The aide-de-camp did not want to leave him, but he yelled to the young man again. He left in a run. Rahim bent down and took Adewale in his arms. His ceremonial uniform was soaked through with blood, and he was still. Rahim started to take off his shirt to see where the bleeding was coming from and tried to stop it. As he removed his shirt and turned him on his back and looked, paramedics arrived, and Adewale was quickly removed from the podium, lifted into a helicopter, and flown away. Rahim was taken by his security and returned to the palace. His family was safe. Adewale was operated on immediately at the Lagos University Teaching Hospital, and he made a full recovery, although he lost some parts of his lungs. There was nobody arrested for the attempted assassination, but 30 school children died in the stampede, and double that number were wounded. Rahim was very grateful to Adewale for saving his life for the third time, and he continued to let him know that he was very dear to his heart. Adewale returned to the palace on his full recovery and continued to be Rahim's right-hand man. He had a say in everything that Rahim had to do as the president. Iya and Moji were very grateful to him for saving Rahim's life, and for days, Moji would tell him how much she appreciated all that he had done for Rahim and herself. In December of that year, the Vice President Major General Omude died in his sleep. He had been 58 years old, and in the wake of his death, the country was again thrown into the limelight of the world with criticisms of human rights violation, both within homes and outside of homes in the government. The Vice President's death brought out a side of the people of this African country in how they conducted their personal lives, and it was a great embarrassment to the government. Omude came from one of the minority ethnic groups in the middle belt of the country. His appointment to vice president was one of Adewale's advices to Rahim to appease the many minority groups in the country who were usually underrepresented in the government. He had been a ceremonial figurehead and had not been allowed to make any contribution to the running of the country. He was aware of this, but he went along with them. It was determined at autopsy that the cause of death was a heart attack. Preparations began for a state funeral. Friends of the country were invited from all over the world. Several heads of states and presidents of many countries came, as well as several representatives and the diplomatic corps. Omude had been a Christian, and after the funeral service at the Christ Cathedral Church in Victoria Island, where he had been a parishioner, the over 1,000 people who were in the church filed in convoy of cars to the graveyard where he was to be buried. He had a wife and 3 daughters, who at the time were in their 20s. The short ceremony at the gravesite commenced with the Anglican Archbishop of the country reciting some prayers. A hymn was sung, and the casket containing Omude's remains were lowered into the grave. At this point, there began a wave of wailing by the many women present. Mrs. Omude looked composed, wearing very dark sunglasses and a long black dress, moved to the edge of the grave, and taking the shovel from the archbishop, tossed some dirt onto the lowered casket. Her daughters followed her and did the same, from the oldest to the youngest, performing the dust-to-dust rite of burying their father. The daughters moved away from the grave to give other people room to perform the rites of throwing the soil on their relative's casket, but Mrs. Omude did not move from her position at the edge of the grave. Adewale, noticing this, looked into the woman's face and, seeing the firm set of her jaw, knew that there was going to be trouble. He quickly scanned the crowd gathered there, trying to anticipate what was coming. Before he could arrive at an answer, the archbishop's assistant offered the shovel to Omude's younger brother so that he could perform the rite of burying his brother. As he reached toward the shovel, a woman appeared from somewhere in the crowd and shouted that it was her turn and her children's turn to perform the dust-to-dust rite before the extended family members. Everybody turned to look in her direction, and they saw a very petite, beautiful young woman who could not have been more than 25 years old, dressed in iro, buba, and gele, made out of black cotton lace fabric. She was moving briskly and pushing people out of her way as she came to the edge of the grave. Behind her were 3 young boys, aged 7, 5, and 3 years old, equally well dressed in traditional outfit. The older son held his baby brother's hand. She arrived at the edge of the grave, snatched the shovel from the assistant, and as she made to take some dirt and pour it on the casket, Mrs. Omude snatched the shovel from her and asked her to leave. She turned to the security detail and instructed them to remove the woman from the place. The younger woman stood her ground. She shouted that she was not leaving. "He was my husband, and he is the father of my 3 sons. They have the right to bury their father too. You cannot deny them that right. It is not your place. They are going to bury their father today," she asserted, and started to wail. Everybody stopped, including the many cameramen. They stopped filming or taking pictures and stared at the spectacle before them. Some of them recovered quickly, however, and started to record everything in frenzy. Adewale, who was standing some distance away from the family, rapidly moved towards the 2 women who, frustrated by the ineffectiveness of their war of words, had launched at each other. The 3 little boys started to cry and call to their mother, Omude's daughters also rushed to the two women, and while two of them pulled their mother away from the younger woman, the third started to lead the boys away from the grave. The younger mother saw this and became more enraged, left Mrs. Omude, and started to tear at the daughter who was escorting her sons. Adewale arrived on the scene as well as more security men. He hugged the young woman to him and tried to calm her. Brigadier Adewale, she called to him. They have a right to bury their father. That is all they will have of him for the rest of their lives. In future, they should be able to say with pride that they had a father and that they were able to bury him when he died. Please don't deprive them of that, she tearfully pleaded with him. While Adewale was trying to direct the security men to restore order, another woman appeared from the other end of the crowd with 4 daughters in tow, all dressed in traditional outfits. I am here with my children too. They have a right to bury their father as well, and nobody is stopping me today, the woman exclaimed with determination. Adewale looked around in bewilderment. He expected more women to show up with children, claiming that Omude was their father and that they had come to bury him as well. The second woman, who looked like she was in her late 30s, confronted Mrs. Omude. You cannot deny that you don't know me or my children, she said to her. You have always banned them from coming to their father's house to see him. You and I have met several times, and the general told you that these are his children. I know, Asuke, she continued, pointing to the young, beautiful mother of the boys. The general introduced her to me. They are his sons. You are just angry because you didn't give him any sons. All these children have the right to bury their father. That is the least that they are entitled to. Mrs. Omude, nevertheless, continued to refuse to have the children perform the dust-to-dust rite. She yelled at her security detail to remove the women, calling them liars and impostors. She denied knowing any of them and accused them of coming to tarnish her deceased husband's good image. Stop lying to yourself, the second woman advised Mrs. Omude. He tarnished his own name before he died by lying and cheating. Personally, I don't care for him and his lying ways. All I care about is that my children be allowed to perform the rite of burying their father. It is their right, and you cannot stop that. The whole world is here to see. She folded her hands on her chest, waiting for any security man who dared to touch her. Nobody dared. All the men, including Adewale, stood by helplessly, and the world, in the forms of the many cameramen and photographers, continued to record the whole drama. What do you think should be done? Adewale, in a feeble voice, asked the Archbishop. The Archbishop looked at Mrs. Omude, who returned his look with a threatening glare. He looked at the other two women. Asuke, who was in tears, had a look of pleading about her, while the other woman looked determined to get what she came for. The Archbishop did not respond. The world, in the form of many diplomats and many representatives of government from all over the world, and the 12 presidents of the countries that were very close friends of the nation, who had come to pay their last respect, patiently waited. Rahim and Moji stood by too and watched in disbelief. Rahim was disgusted. This is a thing that I can't understand about these Christians, he thought to himself. They lie and deceive themselves, claiming that they don't practice polygamy, and criticize the Muslims who do. Yet they do crazy things like this, creating embarrassment for their families when they die, and such enmity amongst the children they leave behind. This can never happen in a Muslim home. The women know one another, and the children grow up together. Omude's oldest daughter, who was 28 years old, eventually saved the situation. She moved forward, took the shovel from the Archbishop's assistant, and gave it to the second woman. Perform the rite and help your son and daughters bury their father. She turned to Asuke and said to her, when they are done, it will be your turn, and you will perform the rite too and help your sons bury their father. Her mother started to protest, but she took her by her right hand, started to pull her away, and said to her in a firm voice, Mother, they have the right to bury their father. That was the end of it. The two women took turns to throw soil on the casket and they helped their children do the same. Asuke explained to her young sons, "This is your father. He is now dead. You will remember this day with pride, and you will know that you had a father and that you buried your father when he died." As she helped each of them hold a shovel to throw the dirt on the casket. For several days following this, the press was full of articles describing the events and ridiculing the average male citizen of the country. Reporters went onto the streets of many of the cities and interviewed the citizens. The men defended Omude's action and claimed that he did the best that he could to preserve peace in his home. The women, most of whom had similar axes to grind with their men who were chauvinistic husbands at home, and the exploitative male-dominated government, gave vent to their anger and told the world that Omude was an example of what they endured from their men all the time. Adewale decided that he would not say a word about the situation, and on several occasions when he was asked by reporters what he thought of the event or why men in the country do things like this, his response was that General Omude was not alive to explain himself and that he could not speak for the deceased man. Rahim, on the other hand, could not hide his disgust and contempt for the Christian male citizens who, in his opinion, were liars and men not capable of keeping their homes and their affairs in neat order. When he was asked about the event, he told the reporters that the educated Southern men, most of whom were Christians, should reevaluate themselves and their so-called Western education and Western religion when the legacy that they leave their children is embarrassment and enmity between them and their brothers and sisters. He reiterated that the nonsense could never happen in a Muslim home where the men have the courage to bring all their women together and so they know one another and the children and grow up together. A week after Omude was buried, Adewale was appointed the vice president of the country. The news was met with the same reaction the public always greeted whatever the government imposed on them. Some felt that he had been the vice president all along and that he had been running the country. Some people were very angry and felt that someone from their region should have the post. But the majority of the citizens could not be bothered. Adewale, at the age of 46 years, felt that it was at the least that he deserved. At this time, Rahim, true to his promise, was preparing the country for democracy. He allowed many political parties to be formed and pretty much left the people alone as they excitedly campaigned and prepared to elect civilians to the seat of government. Adewale was not happy about this. He had been waiting patiently for the time that he would succeed Rahim as president of the country. He had to come as close as the vice president only to have it snatched from him. He reassured himself that he would become the president of the country. Here ends chapter 7 on page 180. Thank you for tuning in. If you like anything on my channel, please go ahead and like it. If you like what you just listened to, you can read the other chapters preceding it. And if you're interested in purchasing this awesome book, Our Mother's Sore Expectations by Kehinde Adeola Ayeni, you can email the author at Kehinde, her first name, Ayeni, her last name, 26@gmail.com. Again, KehindeAyeni@gmail.com. Thank you and have an awesome day. Bye for now.